Welcome to Riks Europe. My name is Peter Kleppe, and I'm delighted to have as my guest Fred de Fossard. He's with the London-based think tank Legatum Institute, and we're here to discuss the upcoming UK general election, which will be held on the 4th of July. So welcome, Fred.
Thank you very much for having me today, Peter. Good afternoon.
So, what's your thinking about this? It looks like the Conservative Party will be completely destroyed by UK voters.
Yes, it's going to be a seismic shift. It was only 4.5 years ago that the Conservatives won their biggest majority in Parliament since the 1980s. And it looks like that majority is about to totally disappear, and the party could suffer its worst defeat, not just since 1997, but since 1906. And we will see a Labour government come in with potentially the largest majority in British political history. It really is extraordinary, because only a few years ago, many people, including myself, were assuming that the 2020s would be a decade where the Conservatives would be comfortably in power all 10 years.
So, Fred, and how left-wing is Labour really?
That's a great question. The Labour Party has been doing its best to distance itself from the era of Jeremy Corbyn, to say that it's much more of a centrist party, that it's in favour of free markets, that it's not going to increase taxes. And they've done a reasonably good job at persuading the public of that. Big business is making lots of noises, that Labour is not going to be a threat to the economy like it used to be. They're not proposing a huge sweep of nationalisations like they were. But very interestingly, when you look into the policies in the Labour manifesto, there is still a large amount of left-wing, not quite radical, but sort of social democratic policy, which I think would be still way to the left of what we are used to in Britain. They want to decarbonise all electricity by 2030. That is extraordinary, and I really do not think they have a strategy to provide an entirely renewable or zero carbon electricity grid by that point, and that could lead to all manner of things like more expensive energy, more uncertain energy, possibly even blackouts. They also want to do things like get money out of British people's pensions and savings and investments and spend that money on green decarbonisation projects. It's going to be a sort of quite a left-wing green industrial strategy, similar to what Joe Biden's government have done in the United States, I think.
Well, that's deeply worrying. And as I read it, one of the reasons why the voters seem to abandoning the Conservative Party, apart from its complete failure to tackle immigration or mass immigration and migration chaos and boats arriving, and all kinds of problems, seems to be their embrace of net zero, right? So it looks like people in the Tory party or voters are abandoning the Tories for Reform UK of Nigel Farage for those two reasons, right?
This is a really good question. I think if you look at the opinion polling data, you will see the way in which the Conservative vote has been fracturing. So right now, around 30 to 40% of 2019 voters are voting Conservative. So they've lost 6 out of 10 of their previous voters, and we need to look at where they're going. Probably 2 to 3 out of 10 of that 6 are actually going to Reform. Maybe between 1.5 and 2 out of 10 are going to Labour, some going to Liberal Democrats, and then some just not voting at all. So the Tory vote is splintering in all manner of ways, but that right-wing disillusionment is a really, really important part of it. Now, I would say that is overwhelmingly immigration, both legal immigration and illegal immigration, because we're seeing records of immigration that we have never seen in this country's history ever, and the Conservative Party promised for years to bring immigration down. So that's a sort of a trust and a competence issue. They promised to cut immigration in 2010, 2015, 2017, 2019, and they've not just increased it, they've more than doubled it. So that's just the biggest clear reason for Conservative voters and right-wing voters who previously trusted the party to no longer trust the party. Net zero is also interesting, but net zero is a weird one publicly, because net zero is popular in the first instance, but all of the things you have to do to get to net zero are much less popular. We haven't seen the same level of protest and disruption in Britain over farming regulations that you have seen in Europe over net zero. But what we have seen is big heavy industry
Mm.
starting to shut down, troubles at British Steel. Only today, the manufacturer of Vauxhall cars said that they might leave the United Kingdom because of mandates over how many electric vehicles they have to produce every year, and the fact that the government is going to start fining them if they don't manufacture sufficient electric vehicles. Now, of course, these particular industrial policy issues aren't the main reason why people are leaving the Conservatives, but it was quite clear that net zero, as was implemented, meant you had to do a lot of left-wing, heavy regulation, heavy tax kind of economic policies, which is not what Conservative voters want.
Yeah, and Labour seems to be keen to continue with very strong restrictions on gas and oil exploration in the North Sea.
Yes, absolutely. This is going to be one of their central economic policies, and I think it's very worrying. The Conservative Party, to their credit, recently started U-turning on some of their anti-North Sea oil and gas policies. Even though they still had the windfall tax in place, there were some carve-outs to that windfall tax, which meant that if companies were investing in new sites, new drilling, new projects, they would have their tax bill would be reduced. Labour want to get rid of that, and in fact, they want to use an even more aggressive windfall tax to fund more green energy projects. I think this is going to be very dangerous. I think it's going to be terrible for the economy, not just for the jobs in the east coast of Scotland, but for Britain's energy security overall and stability of our energy supply. Because their plan to have a zero carbon grid by 2030 is simply not plausible. So what will happen is we'll shut down our own domestic North Sea gas industry and almost completely shut it down. And instead, we'll just keep on importing gas from the United States or Qatar, which is much more expensive. And actually, pound for pound, it's worse for the environment because that gas has to travel halfway across the world. So it's a very, very bad energy policy. And I think that while Labour has been quite sensible at reducing some of the sort of, more aggressive left-wing policies in various areas, for energy and net zero, they are completely, utterly sort of philosophically committed to these projects and these policies. So I think we've got to strap in for a very, very left-wing and dangerous approach on energy policy.
Now, last but not least, Reform UK.
Yep.
How many seats do you think they're going to conquer?
This is at the moment the most exciting question of the general election. It's something that we're all looking at. We're all studying opinion polls, which are coming out day after day, examining different models, different weighting of voters to see what's going to happen. I think Reform will probably get around 5 MPs. There's a sort of list of seats which they seem very likely to win right now, which is Clacton, where Nigel Farage is standing himself. The Richard Tice, who's the other most significant Reform figure, is standing in Boston and Skegness on the Lincolnshire coast. That is a very important area for Reform because they've had a huge issue with small boats, not arrivals of small boats, but the fact that the hotels in the area have all been used by the Home Office to store asylum seekers. And that's caused a massive problem locally, and the local Conservative candidate has had a very difficult time there. So Richard Tice campaigning there looks quite likely. Great Yarmouth, or also on the east coast of England, could well be a Reform gain. They have quite a prominent candidate there called Rupert Lowe, who was interestingly chairman of Southampton Football Club before politics. And the previous big name Tory, Brandon Lewis, is standing down. So the Conservatives don't have a high profile incumbent in that seat. So that gives Reform another opportunity. And there are also some suggestions that another seat in Essex might go Reform. This one is Basildon and Billericay, where there are some very difficult local issues for the Conservative Party and their candidate there. So I think it's going to be a huge change to British politics. Obviously, with our electoral system, Reform might get 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20% of the vote, but only come out with 5 MPs because in first past the post, you have to target your resources very locally and very efficiently and very effectively. So obviously, that will be a very interesting discussion about the state of our electoral system. But without a doubt, this is going to shape the discussion on the future of the British right for the coming years.
Well, exciting times ahead. So thank you very much for that, Fred de Fossard.
Thank you very much, Peter. Great to talk to you.